Of course, I'm the last one, so I've got the most boring subject, pun intended, talking about water wells and drilling. So I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about something that I'm very passionate about water well drilling. I'm Jim Goddard with the Division of Water Rights, and I regulate well drilling and the well drillers in the state of Utah. Boyd mentioned the difference between statute and administrative rule, and well drilling is kind of one of those different ones where we do have administrative rule that governs the drilling of water wells. The statute particularly tasks the state engineer with regulating water well drilling and other kinds of drillings in the state of Utah. And associated with that, the state engineer also licenses water well drillers, and that's kind of a unique thing in the state of Utah because, as most of you know, most licenses are regulated under the Division of Occupational and Professional Licensing, like your engineer's license, geologist, electrician, doctor, whatever the case. They're all under that umbrella, except for well drillers. We're kind of unique in that aspect. But the legislature, when they created that statute, probably realized that there was no entity better than the state engineer's office to be able to regulate this important industry who are punching holes down into this groundwater resource that we realize is so valuable. And so that's why the state engineer's office regulates water well drilling and licenses water well drillers to make sure that the resource that we've talked so much about today is protected and not damaged through that process. So what I'm going to be talking about, a few topics today, and I only have a half an hour, so don't worry, I'm not going to go for an hour and a half. But a few of the topics I wanted to talk about are just the general situation of drilling in Utah, what's really happening as far as what's being drilled, the permitting process mechanisms, and a lot of those have been already discussed today, but there's a few that I want to touch on that haven't been, the well renovation, replacement, and abandonment process. We also permit and regulate a lot of types of non-production wells, and I'll go into that as far as what we regulate there also. And many of you may not know this because it's fairly new. Back in 2011, the legislature tasked the state engineer with also licensing pump installers and pump installation in the state of Utah. So that's fairly new. And then I'll just briefly go into some of our general administrative rules and construction rules, and then show a few things on our website that you might find interesting about well drilling. So when you look at this and look at your books, the numbers are a little bit different because I've updated them with the most recent numbers. Don't worry, they're not going to be on the test, these numbers, but I did update them with the most recent numbers as of today. So that's why the numbers are a little bit different than what you're seeing in your books. Right now, we have 154 licensed well drillers in the state of Utah, which we issue those licenses and regulate them, and 134 licensed pump installers. Keep in mind, many of those have dual licenses, so they both carry a driller's license and a pump installer's license. And 239 registered operators. Those are people affiliated with the licensee who can be out doing the actual regulated work without the licensee being on site. So it's kind of another classification so that our licensed drillers don't have to be on every well site constantly when they do that. To give you an idea of what's being drilled, last year, for example, we had 882 non-production wells drilled. 604 of those were heat pump wells, so almost 3/4 of the non-production wells that we regulate in the state are heat pump wells, and that's the well that people will drill in order to use for heating, cooling buildings, which is very popular in the state of Utah now, especially for big buildings like schools and public buildings, government buildings, but even a lot of residential uses are putting these systems in. And these are closed loop systems, meaning they don't actually pump water out of the ground. They're simply using the thermal conductivity of the groundwater in place and circulating that through heat pumps at the surface. So that's very popular now. What most of us are worried about, of course, or concerned about are production wells. And you can see last year there were about 400 production wells drilled. And in parentheses, I put the types of drilling methods that are primarily used for those production wells. Most wells are drilled in the state of Utah using air rotary, 21% cable tool. So that's an ancient drilling method that's still very common in Utah, 21%. Most states it's almost completely eliminated to rotary methods, but in Utah we still have a lot of the good old boy cable toolers that are out there still doing a very good job with that. Of the 400 production wells, you can kind of see the distribution there. Most of them are just small domestic irrigation stock wells that are drilled in the state of Utah. Most of them are fairly small diameter, 4 to 6 inches in diameter. This graph kind of shows the distribution of non-production wells versus production wells over since the beginning of this decade, or beginning of the century, I should say, back from 2002. As you can see, back then we were having upwards of about 1,000 production wells drilled a year, but then when the economy collapsed in 2008, that kind of slowed down. Now it's starting to pick up and we're averaging about 400 production wells a year. Conversely, when we look at non-production wells, when the heat pump industry, it's a green industry, when that started coming into place, that really started to boom to where we were having almost 2,000 of those borings drilled a year. And it's kind of come up and down a little bit, but it's fairly stable. And there's still, most schools that you see built in Utah have these systems in there. And this is just real quick a distribution of the wells, production wells drilled ever since we started recording them. I wouldn't trust this until about 1960 when we really started keeping track of drilling and well logs. And so you can see there's a lot of ups and downs that have happened over the course of the years. As far as what's the common drilling method, I already mentioned this, but the three main drilling methods in the state of Utah are mud rotary, cable tool, and air rotary. And I'm not going to go into detail with that. I don't have the time for that. But just to let you know, those are the primary methods. Air rotary being the most popular and most common simply because it's probably the most versatile system. Pretty much any well you can drill with this system as long as you can put the right tooling on the drilling rig. You can pretty much drill through whatever you want with air rotary, whereas mud rotary and cable tool have some limitations with that. And there's some others, flooded reverse for the really big wells like in Salt Lake Valley, for the big production wells for municipalities. A lot of those are with flooded reverse, which is a type of rotary, air rotary and mud rotary combination. And then a few other odds and ends methods for different types of mostly non-production wells are drilled with those other methods. So a little bit about permitting. So the question is, how do you get a permit to drill? And we get that question all the time. I need a permit. Or where's my start card? I need a start card so I can drill and give to the driller. Well, that depends on the type of drill, type of well that you're drilling. And there are a lot of mechanisms, and they've been talked about a lot here today. The application to appropriate, change application, exchange, temporary change, fixed time. So all of those are related to water rights. And so where do you get the permit related to those applications? When the application has been approved, then we send out, we don't call it a permit, we call it the start card with the approval letter. And that's what the owner would then get to be able to give to the driller. And that's what the driller needs to know that there's authorization to actually drill the well. And so that's where the start card comes from. It's not a separate process. It's all in the same process for a production well that you have to do anyway with the water right process. We also have provisional rust letter, and I'll talk a little bit about that and what that means. I won't get into that right this second. And then we also have permits for well renovation, well replacement, and non-production wells, which are separate. Non-production well permits are separate from the water right process and quite a bit simpler and easier to obtain. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail because it's already been covered in previous presentations, but if it's related to a water right application, the start card or the approval comes with the approval of that water right application, whatever it may be. And it can take, there's a definite process that has to be followed through there. And so we get a lot of calls with people say, I need to get a permit to drill, and they're expecting it to be the next day that they get that permit. But for a water well, as we found out, that can take weeks to months to go through that process before it's finally approved and you can get the start cards to actually start drilling the well. How much does it cost to get a permit or a start card? If it's a water right application, it's associated with the filing fee. There's no separate fee to get a start card. It's all part of the water right process for that. For a non-production well, there is no fee for that. There's no cost to file a non-production well application, and the same goes for renovate and replace. There's no fees for those applications. And we've already talked about the appropriation policy as far as whether you can get a new water right or you have to file a change or exchange in those certain areas that are closed to new appropriation or restricted to new appropriations. So a little bit more detail on the application process. The application to renovate, for example, when do you need to do that? And let me actually go and show you where that form is on our website. So Jim already showed you this, but this is the form page. So if you scroll down to the well drilling forms, you can see the main ones that I'm going to be talking about. The non-production well, well renovation, well replacement. Those are all listed on those forms. So if you bring that up, fill it out. Like Jim was saying, the renovate form and the replacement form, you can actually fill in fields and it will auto-fill it in. If you know the water right, you put that in there and it'll pretty much fill out the application for you. You have to, if there's more than one point of diversion, then you have to select which point of diversion or which well that you're going to renovate. And then you print out the form, submit it to us, no cost. It doesn't grant approval to replace a well. So back before 2000, we actually did that. When we issued a permit to renovate a well, that gave also, if the renovation didn't work, that gave approval to replace the well. Well, that's all fine and good, but it sure made a mess of our record keeping because we would never know whether a well was replaced and we could never track whether the old well was abandoned. So that doesn't happen anymore. If you need to replace it after you try to renovate it, it's a separate form. There's no fee. As has been mentioned around, the title and ownership has to be current before you can file that because that application has to be signed by the current owner. And it allows for repair, renovation, and deepening. And you need like I said, you need a separate application for renovation. With the onset of the pump installation rules, we kind of changed the criteria of when you need to file a renovation permit. So in the last few years, this is probably important if you're looking at renovating a well. There's certain criteria as to whether you need to file that. So when you're deepening, repairing, renovating, anytime the well itself is modified, so just the well, that's when you need a renovate permit. If you're doing anything else in the well, like cleaning it, developing it, disinfecting, testing, doing pump work, a renovate permit is not required for that. But when I say that, it still is required to be done by either a licensed driller or a licensed pump installer. So it's still regulated work. You just don't need to get a renovate permit. If it's done by a licensed pump installer or a licensed driller, they have to submit a pump log after they finish that work. So application to replace a well, similar process, similar location to find that well. The replacement well, in order to file this application, the replacement well has to be within 150 feet of the existing well. So that's actually in the statute that's the case. So if you go beyond 150 feet, then that changes the process and you'd have to file a change application to do that. And the owner's responsible, when we issue the permit and the approval letter, the owner's responsible to make sure the licensed driller abandons that existing well. So that's in bold print right on the approval letter that the existing well has to be abandoned. There's no fee. Again, the title and ownership has to be current, and the abandonment, as I mentioned, is a condition of the approval. And we track that. We track both the well log and the abandonment log when the driller submits the start card. So if the driller doesn't abandon that well, he still has to submit to us the abandonment log. So if the driller says the owner refuses to allow me to abandon the well, he's going to file trespassing charges or whatever, he's not going to pay me for it, we can't expect the driller to go do that if the owner's refusing access to that well. When we get that, then we come after, that's not the best way to put it, but we then look to the owner of that to find out why the well wasn't abandoned properly. The well abandonment process, that's It's mentioned before in a couple of presentations, but when we say abandon, a lot of people, when they hear the term abandon, it means leave it alone or just forget about it. By our definition, that's not what it is. Well abandonment, by our definition in the rules, is it has to be sealed from bottom to top with approved sealing material like cement or bentonite. And that's how we refer to well abandonment, and that's a requirement. It has to be done by a licensed driller. There is a distinction between a temporary versus a permanent abandonment. If a temporary abandoned well can be left alone for 90 days without either being permanently abandoned or completed as a well, and that's mostly in the case where an owner runs out of money, or the engineer is trying to figure out whether they need to go deeper or where to put screens or something like that. So they can temporarily put a well on hold, but they have to come back within 90 days to either abandon that well or complete it as a real well. So I already mentioned when the well is replaced, it has to be abandoned as a condition of approval. Teresa, when she talked, she mentioned that sometimes a condition of approval of a water right application or a change application, for example, is that the old well has to be abandoned. So there's impetus there on change applications sometimes as a condition that the old well be abandoned. There's no permit required to abandon a well from a licensed driller, other than the driller needs to notify us before they do that work so that we can send them an abandonment log and they fill it out when they're finished. So application for non-production wells. The types of wells that would be included in this type of application would be test wells. Those are specific wells where you're trying to determine quantity, quality, usually small diameter wells. And it's not the same as a rush letter well, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. Cathodic protection wells, closed loop heat exchange wells, those heat pump wells I was referring to in monitoring wells. And there's a few other types of wells that we also regulate that would be included in that. And why do we regulate those? Because these wells can impact the resource, and that's why the state engineer regulates them with that. And on that same form page, there's the non-production well form. There's no fee for that. Usually it's approved through Salt Lake here in the well drilling section, or any of the regional offices can process those and approve them. We do have a provision where we don't have to, but we can sit on or review an application for up to 14 days before we act on it, just to allow the public an opportunity to see that listing. So it's more of a public notice, and we've added that onto our website. It's non-production well public listing, and I'll show you where that is. And it's on our website in the well drilling pages, and it lists all of the applications that have been submitted, whether they've been approved or unapproved, and they're all listed there. You can drill into each one of those and get all the information. The application is all scanned. All that information is in there. So if you're concerned about somebody drilling a non-production well near you, then you have the access to be able to find out what's going on with those wells. Provisional wells. So this is, as I mentioned, with non-production wells, test wells are included in those. In the past, a lot of situations, people would try to push through production wells under a test well permit, and we usually can catch those pretty good. For example, when we get the application and they put down the location and they put the diameter of this test well is 20 inches. Well, you know they're not going to be drilling a 20-inch test well. That's obviously going to be a large production well. And so that's one of the things we checked on that. So through the non-production well process, we only approve the small test wells that are temporary in nature, small diameter wells. And it's not meant to go ahead and drill a production well because the driller's on site suddenly and he's available, and so you want to hurry and do it. There's another process called a provisional well, or we also call it a rush letter approval, where you can actually get approval to drill the production well before the water right application has been approved. And it allows you to drill the well but you can't put it to beneficial use. You can't start using the water. You can test it, pump test it, and do all that, but you can't start using it until the application has been approved. If it's approved, it's at the owner's risk. If it turns out that their application gets disallowed or not approved, then they would be responsible for abandoning that well. So there is some risk involved, but there is authorization to drill and test and construct, but you just can't put it to use. Those are typically reviewed by the regional engineer, and there has to be justification in that. There's no form per se other than when you submit your application, change, exchange, whatever the case, you submit a written request that you want to start drilling before it's been approved, and then we'll evaluate that. And that's actually in the statute, as you can see there, that allows the state engineer to provide that temporary receipt to drill a well. So moving on, that was kind of the application and how do you get a permit to do well drilling activities. So I've covered that. Now let me get into a little bit of the well drilling rules. And I'm not going to cover a lot here, even though that's the main thing that I do. I work primarily with the water well drillers in terms of making sure that they live by the rules, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this class for that. But if you're interested in finding out what all of our rules are, I'll show you at the end where you can find our handbook, which has the rules and a lot of other guidance related to that. And that's what our handbook looks like. And it's related to Administrative Rule R655-4. That's one of those rules that the state engineer does have, and it's specific to regulating drilling in the state and licensing and regulating water well drillers. So what are the scope of those rules? What do we actually regulate, and what is required to have a license to do? We regulate any production well that's greater than 30 feet deep. So that's what these rules pertain to, are wells that are deeper than 30 feet. Those are permitted, production wells are permitted through all those processes that we've already talked about. The water right application, change, exchange, all of those for underground points of diversion result in a permit or a start card to drill. Those, you can see the different types of wells that are included under that we regulate. And then non-production wells also deeper than 30 feet. So any of these types of wells that are less than 30 feet, you don't have to have a license for to drill that. You could do it yourself in that case. And so that's something to remember. But there is a lot of confusion on the 30-foot rule, and that is it only applies to having to have a license to do it. It doesn't apply to not having to have a water right. If it's less than 30 feet, you still have to have the water right to use the water. It's no different than surface water or deeper groundwater. That shallow groundwater is the same. You have to have a water right for it. You can just drill it yourself. That's the only difference. Wells that are excluded from the rules are, as I mentioned, anything less than 30 feet. Geothermal wells are not part of those rules. However, the state engineer does regulate geothermal wells, and those are wells that have water that have temperatures greater than 120 degrees C or 248 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are regulated under a separate set of rules under the state engineer's office. So we do regulate those, but not as part of the same set of rules. We don't regulate exploratory or geotechnical borings, structure wells, like wells that are in a dam or an embankment or a man-made structure, we do not regulate. And dewatering wells, if it's not going to impact an aquifer. If it does, so basically any wells that are going to go into an aquifer where they're going to leave the hole open or put a casing in it, we regulate those type of holes. And well drilling by statute definition is the act of drilling, constructing, repairing, renovating, deepening, cleaning, developing, or abandoning a well. So any of those activities we regulate, and then you have to have a license to do those. And then more recently in 2011, pump installation was included in that. Administrative rules, just real quick. I don't think any of these are on the test, but I just wanted to briefly go over what we really regulate administratively with the drillers. As I mentioned, a license is required for the drillers and pump installers, and that's based on experience. Testing, and usually the testing lasts for pretty much 8 hours. Sometimes it goes into 2 days. So it's fairly rigorous. They have to post bond. They have to have continuing education every 2 years, and then they renew it every 2 years, so it's a 2-year license. And the same with the registration of their rigger operators. We do have a system for tracking violations and infractions and an enforcement process. There's many things that can happen to a driller if they don't follow the rules, from probation to suspension to revocation, and we also have fines that can be issued for those. We define a well completed when the driller removes his rig from the site. So that's how we define a well's complete, when the driller moves off site. And some requirements during construction, the driller has to drill at the approved location. That's something that the driller has to check. So this brings up an interesting point. It's kind of been touched upon by some of the presentations is, well, my approved point of diversion, how close is that to where I was really going to drill? And that's something that, we're always asked. If we were to follow the letter of the law, then we would require everybody to drill exactly where that point of diversion is on the approved water right. Imagine how difficult that would be. That means everybody drilling a well would have to get a licensed survey out there and survey it exactly where it's been approved. And anybody who's dealt with this realizes that's probably, it may not be the best place to drill. So we don't necessarily always follow the letter of the law. It's kind of a case-by-case situation. A lot of times we follow a rule of thumb similar to the replacement well distance, which is 150 feet away. We kind of use that same rule of thumb with drilling a well. As long as you're within 150 feet of the approved point of diversion, then it's probably going to be okay. But again, it's a case-by-case scenario. But if we really wanted to be sticklers on the statute, we would require every well to be drilled exactly where it's been approved. And to be honest, I don't know that very many wells are drilled exactly where it's been approved, but hopefully they're within that 150-foot zone. The licensed driller has to have their name or license number on the rig, and they have to carry a card which we issue them so you can verify that they do have a license. And either the licensed driller or registered operator has to be on site during regulated drilling activity. And they have a lot of reporting that they do. They have to submit the start card to let us know when they're starting to work. So we know exactly where every driller is that's active in the state, where they're at, who they're drilling for, when they started. And so we know, and we can go out and do spot inspections on them. We don't inspect every well, but we inspect quite a few of them. And so we have that opportunity there. When we get the start card, we send the driller a well log, and we track that well log. It's specific to that well. It's not just a blank form. We print it out specific to that water right, that owner, and then we send it to the driller, and they fill that out. So we track those well logs from cradle to grave to make sure we get them. If we don't get them from the driller can't renew their license. So we make sure we get every one of those back. And the same with abandonment logs. Pump logs, we can't do that because there's no permitting or start cards issued for pump work. We just have to kind of trust those that they're being sent in. And as far as pump work, there's no start cards, so we don't often know where they're at, but there's a lot of self-policing going on amongst the industry to make sure that everybody's doing a pretty good job of making sure they have a license and submitting that information. Pump installation rules, I mentioned that already. One thing just to be clear on that is it does require a license if you're doing work professionally and for compensation. But if you're doing pump work on your own well, on your own property, you don't have to have a license. That was a caveat that the legislature put into that, is if you're doing your own pump work, you don't have to have a license to do that. And this isn't on the test, but I just wanted to bring this up. If you do have a public supply well that you're drilling, there's a whole nother set of regulation that you want to be aware of, and that's with the Division of Drinking Water, because they regulate public supply wells. So our rules still apply, but they have another layer of rules that you'll now have to consider, and I've kind of talked about some of those as well. And they have an approval process for public supply wells. It's probably more rigorous than ours. And it makes sense given that they're public supply wells and they have to make sure that they're done properly. So just a few construction components that are in the rule book. None of this is on the test. This is kind of what, these are more chapter headings. Each in the rule book, there's pages and pages that deal with these things. We regulate the drillers to protect the resource. In the process of doing that, there's a lot of technical regulation in the rule book in order to make sure they do that. And so you can see some of those technical regulations pertain to well casing, making sure they use the right kind of casing, their joints are good and don't leak, their screens are good, perforation, surface seal, and interval seals are probably our most important regulation to make sure that the aquifer is not contaminated by surface water or by other poor quality zones, and that they're sealed off properly. So aquifer protection is a big deal with us. How the well's completed at the surface, special requirements for wells like monitoring wells or heat pump wells we have, and we have requirements for deepening, rehab, and renovation, and well abandonment, and pump installation and repair. So a lot goes into each of those topics, but I won't discuss it here. So just in the last minute or two, I wanted to show you, Jim didn't touch on this, but I wanted to show you a lot of the information that is available about well drilling on our website. So he mentioned our main programs here. So if you look at the well drilling program, you can access it there. As Jim said, you can also get to it from that drop-down box, but let me just go there. A lot of information is here. I mentioned the rule book. If you want the rules, you can go into the official Division of Administrative Rules website and get them, but what I would recommend is going to this great big hyperlink here to download the Water Well Handbook in PDF. That has the rules, it has the statute, it has a lot of guidance document and a lot of other information all in one handbook. So that's very helpful to have if you're doing anything with water wells. If you want to know, all the water well drillers licensed are listed here, and you can drill into any one of those and get their contact information, the type of drilling that they're licensed in, where they're actively drilling, and also everything that they've submitted in the past. If you want to look at their well logs, you click on the date, and that will give you access to their well log that they submitted. If you want to look at the water rights they're drilling under, you can click on those. They're all hyperlinked with that. So, and this drop-down box here, you can list it in a lot of different ways. If you want to list it by company name, license number, the pump installers are listed there. If you want to look at people who, like license number 1, and you want to see that, even though they're not currently licensed, you can look at every license in the past, whether they're active or not, and you can also find registered operators on that website. So a lot of information there. Well drilling database, this is a lot of good information. You can print pump installation reports. That non-production well list that I showed you before is linked there. If you know the well identification number, which is a method that we use to link a well log to a water right, if you know that number, you can search it through here. The location calculator, the map server, the same thing that Jim was showing, if you link on that, it will show you well logs. So you can click on that one, and it'll show you all the well logs as you drill in, and you'll be able to print those well logs from that. And if you want to do a location search, you can search by township and section, township, and range. You can do a radius search if you know UTM coordinates. So if you've got the UTMs from a GPS and you want to find out what wells are around there, you can enter that in. And we have filters or search criteria if you want to define it even more by when it was drilled, how deep the wells were drilled, the diameter range, the type of well. All of those, you can use those filters to refine your search even more. Well drilling statistics, a lot of those that I showed you can find here for pretty much every year that we've kept records. You can find different statistics. Here's an example of 2016. It shows you the different distributions of wells. You click on any one of these and it'll actually give you a list of all those wells. And if you want to look for something, even though our list on the page only goes to about the year 2000, if you wanted to, actually, I don't see the dialog box in here. Oh yeah, it's up here. You can change, right at the end of the dialog, you can change it to whatever year you want. So you could put 1960 in there and it will bring up the statistics for that. So that's a neat little tool that a lot of people don't know about. And then a lot of things that are specific to licensed drillers that they go and look into. And then just well drilling links. If you're looking for information on well drilling, there's the government agencies within the state and federal that deal with well drilling. The local and regional and national well drillers associations are linked there, so you can get information there. And just in general, if you're a well owner and you want information about well drilling or drilling wells, then there's 3 good links there where you can find out information. And if you have a complaint about a well driller, they've committed a violation that you want to complain to us about, then we have this enforcement referral form that you can print out, fill out, and submit to us, and that would engage us into an investigation in that driller. So it's taken a minute to come up, but there it is. So, and so you would submit that to us, and then we would start an investigation on that driller. So there's a lot more information on our website. Play around with it. It's a lot of good information. But with that, I think I'll end, and if there's any questions. I know it's pretty boring, but especially at the end of the day. Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.